Hello and welcome to the NZ Ahead podcast. I'm Liz and today I've got a really special show for you. I'm interviewing a teacher. She's American. They moved to New Zealand a few years ago and she's now living in New Zealand and working as a teacher. Her name is Jo. I'm going to introduce you to her in a minute. But first of all, just a quick backstory of the show and how we came to meet Jo. Jo's husband, Ryan, who I have interviewed a few times now on the podcast. You'll remember him. He talked about money and cost of living in America compared to New Zealand. He's just fabulous. He is part of our New Zealand private community group. And when I was looking for a teacher to interview, he said, "Oh, my wife Joanne is a teacher. I'm sure she'd be happy to talk to you." So that's who you're going to meet. And that's how I met Joanne. This episode is just packed with absolute goodness. If you are moving to New Zealand with kids, or if you're moving to New Zealand and you want to be a teacher, you are going to love this show. Honestly, I homeschooled my kids, so I don't know much about the schooling system. And I was just sat with my mouth open, listening to everything that Jo had to say. It's such good stuff. The questions that I put to Jo, basically what happened is I went to our private community. We've got a private Slack group filled with people who are all wanting to move to New Zealand and are all supporting each other on the journey of getting to that point where they can say they're moving to New Zealand. And I went to that Slack group and I said, "Look, I'm going to be interviewing Jo. What questions do you want me to ask?" And honestly, you should have seen it was like, dun, 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 just all these questions just piling in that people wanted to know about when I moved to New Zealand with kids. I want to know what's going to be happening at the school. So as I said, you are going to love, love, love this show. I want to talk to you later after the show. If you want to know more about the New Zealand Calling private community, I'm coming into that Slack group and getting those videos all about living in New Zealand, moving to New Zealand, then hang around to the end of the show and I promise to tell you more about it then. But until then, sit back. You've got an extra long episode here. You're going to absolutely love it. And let's meet Jo.
Got it.
Welcome to the NZ Ahead podcast. Everything you need to know about moving to and living in New Zealand.
There's a whole world here.
So nice to be with you again.
You'll be right.
Kia ora. We call it Aotearoa around here, bro.
We are your hosts, Liz and Brian.
Amazing New Zealand in the southern seas.
See, that's where I belong. That's home.
Jo, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining me. I'm just going to give you a quick introduction and then I'm going to throw it all over to you. But basically, we have got a private New Zealand Call-In community group. And within that group, we've got teachers moving over to New Zealand and they are desperate to know about what it's like to be teachers in New Zealand. And also, like as a parent, you want to know like what the schools are like and what the setup and things like that. So Ryan, who is your husband, has been on the podcast a couple of times before and he's absolutely wonderful. And he let it slip. He's like, "Oh, my wife's a teacher." And we were like, "Ooh, this could be good." So I just want to thank you so much because, we've sort of pounced on you and sort of grabbed you and said, please go and do this podcast for us. And here you are. So I just want to say thanks very much for that, for joining us.
I'm happy to do it. I wish I had known more before we had moved.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, as a mum, you just want to know so much, don't you? It's the major thing about moving to a different country when you've got kids, isn't it? So anyway, Jo, could you just introduce yourself and we'll just take it from there?
Yes, of course. So, kia ora, I'm Jo Bevins. I'm a teacher here in New Zealand. I'm currently teaching year 1, which is what in the States we would call kindergarten. I've been teaching for a little over 13 years. I'm a specialist teacher in the States. I work with kids with learning differences, but here I'm just a plain old classroom teacher.
Sure, not a plain old classroom teacher, but we'll talk about those about your different, your special. Oh, spit it out, Liz. We'll talk about that later on in the show, about how you've changed, roles. But I've got to be totally honest with you, Jo. I put all my questions out to our community because I homeschooled my kids, and I just said, what is it you want to know about schools and teaching? And they gave me a list as long as your arm.
It's a long list.
As your arm, yeah. I sent it to you and I was like, oh, please don't be scared off. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to go through those questions that those people have given to me, and we can just chat as we go along. Are you just happy to do that?
This is good. Fire away.
Thanks so much, Jo. Thank you. Right, so the number one question, first of all, I'm going to just ask you is, a lady said, I'm a trainee teacher in the UK and I don't have my credentials by the time I move. So she's going to be moving here and she's going to be doing teacher training, when she gets here. But she's worried about her chances of getting a job. How, as a teacher, what do you think about that?
Well, so I tell her not to worry. So right now we do have a teacher shortage in New Zealand, and the pandemic has not helped. So some people have returned to teaching because it's a very stable career. So we've gotten some of our teachers back over this long lockdown, but we've also lost some, and there's plenty of roles available. So not to worry about getting a job. I think too, when I read the question, there was some question on what type of training do you need to have to be a teacher here in New Zealand. And since I didn't do my initial teaching training here, I can only speak to what I've seen. But here I've got friends who have completed bachelor's degrees in teaching, and they're teaching in classroom roles. And then I have friends that have completed teacher qualifications or having a teaching diploma, which isn't a full 4-year degree, but it has all the practical bits about teaching, and they have the same classroom job. So once you're qualified to teach in New Zealand, there are positions available. Right. The real trick is getting qualified, which can be tricky when you come from overseas.
Yeah. Okay. You were qualified when you came over, though, weren't you? Did you just walk straight in? Oh, you weren't?
No. Oh. So I had read all the things that I needed to bring to do my qualifications, and there was a long list of paperwork. But I thought we're talking a couple of months, and I'll be qualified to teach. I've been teaching over a decade. I didn't think I'd have any trouble, but it actually took me nearly 8 months to get qualified. The NZQA process, which is the government organization that looks at your qualifications, that process alone took about 6 months. And then my undergraduate degree wasn't in teaching. I had an alternative pathway to becoming a teacher, and so I ended up getting a master's degree in teaching, but I got a master's of science degree, and that doesn't exist in New Zealand. So when it wasn't an initial just, this is okay. So even with 10 years of teaching and a master's degree, I still struggled to get qualified.
Oh, that's crazy, isn't it? Because you walked straight into it.
Yeah. So it was okay. The teacher council did something called the discretionary pathway. So they that's where a real person looks at it and isn't just ticking a box and said, okay, well, she's got this, and this. Yes. And so it really, once it got to that level, it was fine. And I didn't have any trouble finding a position. It was simply going through the bureaucracy. So I would suggest anybody coming over to go ahead and get started on their NZQA qualifications now where you are, because that can take quite a long period of time.
That's really good advice. Yeah, because that's not something you would think of, is it? That's really great advice. Where do you live, Jo?
So we live in Auckland, what we'd call suburb, at the very end of the Whangaparoa Peninsula, in a town called Gulf Harbor. Right. So we're a short 50-minute ferry drive from the central business district, but really in a world of our own because we're at the end of a peninsula.
Yeah. I know when Ryan talked about living there, it sounded like this perfect little community that you've got there, and he gets the ferry over to work in Auckland, and it just sounded so lovely. But were you like intent on getting a job within that area, or did you mind where you worked? Or
We picked the area to live in because we knew that they had great beaches and good schools. And so we said, okay, this is where we want to live. And then it was like, okay, now this is where I want to work, because it takes forever to get off the peninsula. It's almost a good 20 minutes just to get to the main highway, and then another 10 or 15 minutes somewhere else. So I didn't want a long commute. So I went around to the primary schools and offered my assist. Oftentimes you have to at first I took a teacher aide job while I was waiting for my qualifications. And then once I got qualified, it was the wrong time of the school year to get a permanent position. Right. So I looked at relief teaching, which is our substitute teaching. And that's often a really good way to get hired. Well, I had applied for a position as a relief teacher, and it just turned out that the school in our neighborhood, Gulf Harbor Primary School, right down the street from our house, they had somebody who for health reasons left at the end of the year, and they had a position open, and they were interviewing candidates on Christmas Eve. So everybody laughs that I was interviewed on Christmas Eve.
What a lovely Christmas present, hey? How perfect is that? That was meant to be.
So it's great. So our kids go there, and it's in walking distance of our house, and so it really was, this kind of serendipitous thing that happened. But it is really lovely living and working in the same community.
That's fantastic. Oh, I can just imagine your little family in your house there and you're only saying that it takes ages to get to Auckland because you don't want other people to come and live there, isn't it, Jo? You're just like, oh no, it's horrible here, it's so busy, don't come and live here. I know what you're up to.
Well, it's a lovely ferry ride, but you do not want to drive it. No, and you don't want to be parking downtown. So it's a lovely ferry ride. If you have to take the bus, it takes a bit longer, but it's not too bad. But it is quite a drive.
Yeah. I'm so nosy, and I just want to know all about your life and about you, but we are here to talk about what it's like to be a teacher, so I'm going to get back to my questions. And another question that someone asked was, what is the difference in New Zealand? And I've always wanted to know this, actually. If you dream of moving to New Zealand, then you are going to love what I'm about to share with you. 12 years ago, when me and Bri emigrated to New Zealand, we were scouring the internet, trying to find any information that we could about what our life would be like when we got here. And basically all we had was YouTube. So we made this vow. We said, when we get to New Zealand, we're going to create something that we can share with others that answers those questions that you're so desperate to know about. Like, what is your life going to be like when you get here? And that's what I'm here to offer you today. We have created a 5-day free, absolutely free video guide that shows you what it's really like to live in New Zealand. This stuff is unique and it is fabulous. You are not going to find it anywhere else on the internet. And like I say, it's absolutely free. You'll be sent a video every day for 5 days and you will know what it's like in New Zealand. So head over to the website. It's www.nzahead.com/free. One more time, that's www.nzahead.com/free. You are going to love it. What it's like to be a teacher. So I'm going to get back to my questions. And another question that someone asked was, what is the difference in New Zealand? And I've always wanted to know this, actually. Between a private school and just a normal regular school?
Yeah, so so we actually have a couple, this isn't actually a clear-cut question. First off, most schools in New Zealand are public schools. There's very few private schools in New Zealand. They do exist, and they are options for parents, but it's nothing like it is in the States. And so we have many, many more public schools than we do have private schools. Now, we also have a third category of schools that doesn't really exist elsewhere, and we have what's called state integrated public schools. So these are Catholic schools, Christian schools, Steiner schools, Montessori schools, where they are privately owned. The school buildings and all of that are privately owned, but they teach the New Zealand curriculum, and the Ministry of Education funds per student. So it's a little bit of that private partner, private-public partnership that we see in a lot of other areas in New Zealand. That happens in schools too. Now, private secondary or high schools are a little more common, and I think some parents choose private schooling in the secondary schools because they want, they might want a different curriculum, like the UK Cambridge curriculum is offered in some of the private schools. They might feel that it's slightly more rigorous than our public schools. So there are some secondary options, but not as many primary school options. Most kids in New Zealand go to public schools.
Yeah, because I know there's a few people on the community, and they'll say, how do what are the private schools like, and how do we get our kids into private school? And it is, once you've lived here and your kids, although I say my kids didn't go to school, they did. They went to school for 2 years in New Zealand. You just think, why would you send your kids to private school, a primary private school in New Zealand? It seems a bit pointless, doesn't it?
Yeah. And even, in the States, everything is always about getting ahead and making sure that you're going to be able to be accepted into that university that you dreamed of, your first choice. And university acceptance here is just different. They're all public universities, so they're happy to take kids from public schools, and it's not this big, I've got to build my resume, I've got to go to the best, prep school. None of that even exists.
That's a really good point. I didn't know that, actually. When you sit and think about it, yeah, of course, all the universities are public, aren't they? Whereas in America, there's private universities. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah, a lot of private universities. I went to private university for my undergraduate, and then I did a public university for my graduate. And I'm like, why did I spend all this money? You get an education. Yeah. Like both ways. Oh, that's a really good point. Yeah. And the Steiner schools, and what was the other one you said? The Steiner schools and Montessori. Yeah. They're quite popular in New Zealand. Those are harder to find. I wish there was more state integrated Montessori schools, but they do exist. And if that's something people are interested in, then they may choose to live in those areas where they have that type of school. But the state integrated Christian/Catholic schools, those are more common. Right. So yeah. Oh, okay. Right. Number 4. Oh, God, I was going to go. Number 4. I'm just looking at my questions. So these are in no particular order. Literally, it was so funny because when I said I'm talking to a teacher, I thought maybe 1 or 2 questions were going to come in, and it was just like, vroom, 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 ask her this, ask her that. So I'm sorry if these are all jumbled up, but I think one of the biggest things that I noticed coming from the UK, my son was 4. They start school at 4 in the UK, well, depending on their birthday. In New Zealand, so he was born in June, and they start school in the UK in September. So he went and had his first year reception in that September. That's right, yeah. And he was a baby. He was like 4 and a month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever it was. And what I loved about when I came here is the kids in New Zealand don't start until they're 5 years old, do they? But yeah, and it's quite interesting because when they start at 5-year-old, that means the day your child turns 5, you can rock up to your public school and they will take you. So now I know it's not quite so simple. They like to do a transition process. Please don't say that because the reception teachers will be like, no. But legally, if you are 5 years old, you're entitled to start school on your birthday in New Zealand, which is quite different because in the States it's the same. A child has to be 5 before they start, typically in August or September. Right. Yeah. So, but what I've always wanted to know, Jo, well, 2 things. I wonder what it's like for a kid on its 5th birthday when he wakes up and goes, "You're 5 today? Come on, off to school then." No cake for you today, not till after school. I've always wondered that. And the second thing I wonder is, so if they're 5, so what is the year in New Zealand? They start in February, is that right?
School starts in
Right.
February, yeah. And we've got 4 terms.
Yep.
So the first term goes from February to April, and then we get a 2-week break, and then you're back and you go to July and you get another 2-week break. You get a 2-week break in October, and then you're done the school year, typically mid-December.
Right.
So it's 4 terms with 2-week break in between each term and a 6 to 7 week summer holiday.
So what would happen then, Joe, is if your child was turned 5 in, let's say, August, so halfway through, how does that work? Do they only get half a year's education, or do they get held back?
Well, so this is complicated because it also depends on the child. So many kids who start in August do what we call a year 0. So typically we start counting at year 1, but a lot of kids get a year 0 or / reception, depending on what they call that. And then what they'll do is they'll have two terms at school, and then the next school year they'll start as a year 1.
Right.
So they actually don't just get 2 terms at school, they get 6 terms at school before they go on to year 2. Now, what gets really kind of tricky is if you've got a kid that turns 5 in May. So they would technically have 3 terms before they would start their year 2. So those kids are kind of our bubble kids, and depending on the school, they may keep them for an additional 4 terms, or they may move them on. And often that depends on how the student is doing at school, what level of school readiness they had before they started. So it's not a clear-cut answer, but hopefully that helps.
That really, really helps. And also it reminds me, because Tess, my daughter, well, they both my children have got birthdays in June, but she turned 6 in the June, and her teacher just said exactly what you've just said. Look, it's up to you. She said, but personally, she said, I'd let her stay on and, stay where she is and get that extra experience. Confidence. Especially because she'd come from overseas as well. And, she was just settling in. And to be honest, I think that was the best thing for her, because although she was one of the old ones in her class, and I think it was the best thing for her. But like you say, it depends on the child, I suppose, doesn't it? So
it really depends on the child. And what's really interesting, so New Zealand's early childhood education, our ECEs, are very much, the ECE curriculum is very much play-based. So kids in ECE have very little formal instructional period. They might have a time where they have some songs or do a calendar for 20 minutes a day, but that's as much structure as our ECEs have. It's then, it's based off of the child's interests, and so it's a big difference for kids when they start school. Like all of a sudden, most schools in New Zealand wear uniforms. They teach the New Zealand curriculum, which some schools teach, some schools do teach the New Zealand curriculum through play, but most are more traditional about the teaching of school once they've started school. So it is a big change. And so kids do need to take some time to get used to, okay, it's time to eat. Everybody's eating together. No, you can't just eat when you're hungry. These are things that New Zealand kids learn for the first time when they come to school.
That's really interesting. So when you say that they learn through play, how long does that go on for typically? When does it start becoming more structured? What age are they when it starts becoming more structured?
Yeah, so typically that happens in year 2, and certainly by year 3. So year 1 through 6 is considered primary school. So they're broken into years 1 and 2 are the junior school, years 3 and 4 are your middle school, and your years 5 and 6 are your senior primary school. And so often you think about it in that. So you might have a school who teaches play-based, teaches the New Zealand curriculum through play, but they wouldn't do it past that junior mark. So certainly by the time they're in year 3, they would be in a more structured learning environment. But some schools really like to keep that junior group, as much play as possible.
So when you were teaching in the US, were you was it quite strict, and were you sticking to a curriculum? And
yeah, well, so in the U.S., things are just structured differently. You might have a state Board of Education, and the state might choose the curriculum. But oftentimes schools had a lot more choice in what they were going to teach, like what curriculum, what textbooks they were going to purchase, those kind of things. Well, in New Zealand, all of that comes from the Ministry of Education. So the same readers that are in the school next to your house are the same ones that are going to be in the school down the block. So when you're changing school, your kids are often going to see the same material all over New Zealand. Doesn't matter if they're North Island, South Island, it's going to look very similar on what their resources and curriculum look like. However, schools are not run by the Ministry of Education. So the Ministry of Education give all of the curriculum and resources to a local board of trustees, and that's for every school. So the board of trustees is a bunch of volunteers who are elected by the community to run the school. So they're in charge of hiring, they're in charge of setting the school's purpose and values, and they're in charge of how that curriculum is going to be administered. So they can't change the curriculum, but they can just determine how that curriculum is administered to the kids. And so that's why you'll see differences among schools. They might feel a little different because that board of trustees might have a different focus or a different area that meets the needs of their local community that they want to focus on. So it can vary quite a bit, that flavor, but what the child learns at school is going to be the same across every school in New Zealand, every public
And I
school.
suppose that's easier as a teacher, from a teacher's standpoint as well, because if you moved from school to school, not that that's ideal that you're going to move from school to school, but say you did move jobs, the curriculum, you don't have to start all over again and learn a whole new curriculum, I suppose. Was that easier? Would you think that'd be easier? Or?
Yes and
really?
no. So the thing about the New Zealand curriculum is it's this big kind of broad ideas, but it doesn't exactly tell a teacher how they have to teach those ideas. And many teachers love that. They just love, okay, I have to teach cultural diversity. So I'm going to teach, this and this and this, and because I'm interested in that. And as a teacher in New Zealand, you have a lot of flexibility to build your own inquiry topics around the curriculum. It doesn't tell you've got to teach. I know in the States it was like, okay, I'm a fourth grade teacher and I have to teach Native American history this year because that's the year we teach Native American history. So that doesn't happen like that in New Zealand. You've got to teach cultural responsibility and cultural responsiveness, and you get to kind of look and see how you're going to do that.
Right, that makes sense. I think that's really cool, though, isn't it? I'm listening to that, and I'm thinking, wow, if I was a teacher, I'd be loving that, because, like you say, you're allowed to bring your own flair to it and your own ideas as long as you stick within that curriculum. Is that right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I think that's going to make a lot of people happy then, isn't it? Because, like you say, if they've come from... Will that make them happy? I think it will, but...
I don't know. Well, it's two sides of a coin. So there's something nice about knowing what I'm supposed to teach and be giving all the materials to teach that thing. So if I'm teaching Native American history, then I'm going to have, readers that support that, and we're going to have video series, and there's going to be, experts in the community that every year they speak about that one thing to the classes. And so there's a lot, but here in New Zealand, teachers make all of that up, and they often make all of that up every year.
I get you.
Like our school has a 2-year curriculum cycle. So I know when I put together my Matariki, which is our Maori New Year, when I put together that unit, in 2 years, I can use that unit again. But I had to put it together the first time. So that's another thing. So there's a little more responsibility from the teacher to provide the actual activities and resources that go along with the wider curriculum, if that makes sense. So it's two sides to a coin. Yes, you've got freedom. You can do it, what you care about and what you want, but then you also are going to have to, bring
come up with
that
the goods
stuff to it.
Be honest, Joe. Is there a bit of competition between you teachers? Like, oh, look, I've done this for Matariki this year. Oh, well, it's not as good as my unit standard that I did last year. Is there a bit of pressure there, Joe?
I mean, teachers are, we're people, and all people have a little bit of that in them. But I have to say that New Zealand teachers, by and large, are professional, cooperative, and collaborative. And that's part of our professional standards. And collaboration really is something that's ingrained in initial teacher education in New Zealand. Even their practicums are done collaboratively. So it's hard to be a New Zealand teacher and not be able to work collaboratively. Yeah. So I would say that while, of course, there's always going to be a little bit of that, it's nothing. So in the States, I don't know if you follow, you probably don't follow teacher boards, but if you go on Pinterest and you're like, oh, look at the the classroom doors outside, and they decorate the classroom doors, and there's like crazy decorations. Every month it changes, and it just seems like everybody's trying to one-up one another. I haven't seen any of that here. It's more like, man, I really liked those Matariki stars. How'd you do them? Oh, I'll send it to you. Oh,
yeah, that's better. That's better, isn't it? Yeah, that's much better. Did you feel a little bit out of your depth when I'm firing off now? I'm asking my own questions. This isn't something someone's asked. I'm just being nosy. But when you came over from the States, and there you are, you've spent 8 months getting your qualification, you're all set, you walk into the school and they're like, right, okay, off you go, Joe. Just get on with it and do what you want and, teach the kid. Did you feel out of your depth a little bit?
I mean, kids are kids and teaching is teaching. So there's certain fundamentals that don't change. You like your classroom management, your relationships with kids, how you've done things for a long time. You don't have to change those foundations. But that first year really was hard. I mean, it was just really hard getting my mind around, okay, so now my topic is science and space. And okay, I've got to come up with something that we want to teach. And now we work together as a team to create those things. But for somebody not saying, okay, you need to, teach this, this, and this. So that was a difference for me. And it took a while. So my first year, it was long hours, and it was just, getting used to it. Now that I'm 4 years in, I don't have those same long hours. I don't have that same burden of learning something new. And so it does get better over time. But it was hard. It was hard at first, that transition.
Yeah. It sounds a lot like homeschooling. It's like you say, that with homeschooling, that first year was like, ooh, and then you kind of pass that material on to your second child, and, you can use the same old stuff. Poor them. Mm-hmm. They're just sitting there. I know this, or I've heard all this. One question, right, I'm going to get back to my questions. One question that someone said, which I'm intrigued by as well, because again, in the UK, 4-5-year-olds being sent home with books. Do you know what, Joe? Do you know what happened once? Let me tell you a story. We went to Canada with the kids, right, when we lived in the UK. We took our two little kids. Sunny was, 7, and Tess was 4. Literally, she'd just started school. They're really, really hot about you having any time off school anyway. So it was like, oh, well, I don't know about this. 3 weeks in Canada with your kids? And we were like, oh, yeah, it's going to be really educational. And they said, well, they can go as long as they keep a diary and they read every day and they prove that they've, and you know what? I did it every single day. I dragged them to this table and I was like, come on, do your writing. And they were, oh, Mummy, I don't want to. I just want to go and see the bears. It was like, no. But so homework to me is just, is dirty word, to be honest, and I know that there is a lot of pressure on kids to have homework in the UK and America. What is it like in New Zealand? What's homework? How much homework are the children given in New Zealand?
So I will say that every school is different, because remember, every school has that different flavor. So it could be very different because homework's not one of those things that's written into the curriculum. That's, again, how you're going to give the curriculum. So I can only speak to, I've had a contact with about 4 different primary schools, and all 4 of those primary schools had a very relaxed policy to homework. So you might, as a 5 5-year-old, you might be given a book that your mom or dad is supposed to read with you every night, and you might have to write a reading log, but that might be it. Right. And as they go on, so maybe you're in middle primary and that you're 3 and 4, and maybe you might have a website that you're encouraged to go on to continue, to learn your math facts or something like that. But it's not necessarily monitored. It's not a big push. Homework in general in the primary schools, it's not a big push. It's just not part of the cultural norms of New Zealand. Most parents and most Kiwi teachers will say, oh, no, they've done their time. They've been at school 6 hours. We want them to go home and we want them to play. And so that's much more of the culture that you'll see. But again, some schools are different. And I know some parents want more. Like I have never gotten the question like, oh, you've given me too much homework. I've often got the question of, what else can we do?
Oh, really?
What more can you do? What do I need? Yeah, so if anything, that's been my feedback from parents, is that maybe that's not enough. Personally, and I think research supports that homework in primary schools isn't well supported for long-term school outcomes. So it's not something that I care about. And so it's great to be at a school that doesn't really have that big push towards lots of nightly homework, and certainly not a lot of written homework at home.
I just think it's a nightmare for the kids, but more importantly, it's a nightmare as a parent trying to get them to do it. I remember the kids coming home and there was always tears and it was like they were tired. And, the thought of not having to do that was just bliss. It was just, and like you say, go out and play after you've done your schoolwork. And well, that's my view anyway. But the other thing I was going to ask you as well, Jo, is as an immigrant, as coming over here from England, personally, they've worked really hard at accepting my kids and making them feel welcome. But I know people have got this particular children that are coming over on our community that don't speak English. English isn't their first language. How are those children going to be integrated into the school and like welcomed and made to feel at home? What would you say about that?
I don't know if Ryan's made the joke about who lives in Gulf Harbor.
No, he hasn't.
But he's like, old people and immigrants live here. That's who we have, old people and immigrants. So we have a large population of kids who've come to school where English isn't their first language. And so we have a program, English as Second Language. They call it ESOL here. It was ESL in the States, but it's called ESOL here. And so there is a person whose job it is to help those kids not just learn English and be able to converse, but also to make sure that they feel comfortable and that we as teachers know what we need to do to be culturally respectful to them. So that's a big part of there's usually somebody at every school doing ESOL stuff. And so that is something that is available. And so that's kind of nice. So I would encourage people moving here not to worry about it too much. Kids learn languages much faster than parents, and through immersion of being at school every day, they will pick up language, and they're going to have somebody at school supporting them. Depending on where you are, at least in Auckland, where we have so many cultures represented and so many different home languages, nobody bats an eye. Now, you go to rural New Zealand, I can't speak to that. I don't know what that would be like. But I can say in Auckland, and I would guess in your major city areas, you're not going to have that sort of resistance.
Right. How many languages are there in, say, in like your school? How many? When you just say there are lots of different cultures, how many are we talking?
24. Really? Yeah,
really?
There's people from all over the world that's in our school.
That's amazing.
from every different continent too.
Yeah. Oh, that's really. Yeah. I mean, bearing in mind we're from Taranaki, where it's like we are quite rural. So, I mean, I know there's some French children down there, and I think German, but 24 languages. That's amazing.
And I think among our staff, we have 10 out of 40 who were not born in New Zealand. So we have, South African and German and you name it from the UK. Lots of teachers from the UK. So
real multicultural, isn't it? That's
wide variety.
That's fantastic. I hope you all do on school dinners time. It's like, well, you can cook today. Let's have a bit of Indian today, shall we? Just go around all the different cultures. Absolutely different.
When we bring a plate, I always bring Mexican food. That's the thing that I bring because, American food is just stolen from every other culture, but like Tex-Mex is not something we have here. And so I always, I make queso or corn dip or
that's really nice.
Fajitas.
Yeah, that's great. Right, just one more question on the little bit of that I'm thinking about myself. So, because I know that when I used to take Tess to school, she would cry and get so upset and didn't want me to leave. And the teacher would always go, "You just go, Liz. She'll be fine when you leave." And I was always dying to know, what did you do with that child once I left? What would you do if a child was just like screaming? What as a teacher, what do you do to help the child get back into the day?
Well, normally they are fine. Like the minute you're out of sight, typically the tears sort of dry up and they, get to playing with their friend or coloring or doing something. So oftentimes that distraction is the thing you do. So it's like, you assure them mommy's coming back, she'll be here. We typically say after lunch because that's our last thing that they could say. So mommy's coming back after lunch. And then you sort of just say, hey, look over here and see if you can get them
well done.
interested in something else. And 90% of the time that works. Now, I would say if you have that 10% of the time where the child is inconsolable and they can't, that's where you're like, something else is up. This isn't that normal separation anxiety. And you would want to get mom involved in that, figure out a way to help transition because that kind of stress is not good for anyone.
I love the way that you keep mentioning about the child's well-being and, it's so refreshing to hear that. I don't know if I don't know if that's just a New Zealand thing or whether I'm not used to talking to teachers, but it's lovely hearing you talk about, just how the child's well-being is the most important. It's just lovely. It's And talking about the child's well-being, we did have a question who said, what age do they learn about well-being, mental health, citizenship, and relationship education, sex education, things like that? That was a question that came up.
Well, I'll start with the well-being and citizenship because so if you read the New Zealand curriculum, and I encourage any teachers who are thinking about coming over, it's available online. It is a beautifully written curriculum, and they have these key competencies, like what are the things that a child needs to be successful and happy and healthy? And there's these key competencies, and those are all around well-being and well-roundedness. And so I think it's the foundation of the New Zealand curriculum and the New Zealand school. So Hauora is the Maori word for well-being, and that is that's taken into consideration from the time they start school. And so I think that that's an area you can feel comfortable knowing that that's part of professional learning, initial teacher education. It's written into the curriculum. It is the foundation. As far as, sex education and those kind of things. So again, the school, there's a baseline of that in the curriculum, but there is also like the schools themselves kind of work out how they're going to do that. For example, at Gulf Harbor School, we have a outside agency that comes in and speaks to our senior primary kids, so year 5 and 6. And at that point, it's just around boys and girls are separated, and it's all about, your bodies and how they're going to change and puberty issues. Now, when they do get into secondary school, they will have some classes around human sexuality and those kind of things. So some conservative parents that you can opt out of those, and so you will find that some people will opt out. So it would be considered from a American's perspective as a very liberal take to sex ed in New Zealand, but I do think that the schools handle it with there, because it's ran by local volunteers, it's going to be handled in a way that meets the needs of the local community.
That's interesting. You should say that that Americans might think it was a little liberal. Is that because in America they get taught that at a later age, or it's just taught in a different way, or?
Well, it depends on the school district. So in some school districts, like, you're only allowed to teach like abstinence education. You can't even teach things like safe sex practices. Right. So there's a lot of restrictions about what and you certainly wouldn't be able to teach about human sexuality. So it depends. But if you're in New York City public schools, no, you're going to get all of that education. So it really depends on where you are in the states of what you have.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
I find that fascinating. Still, after all these years talking to Americans, I find it absolutely fascinating that each state has its own. It's like a little country, isn't it? Each state is like...
It is like a little country. You got to think of the states as little culturally different countries that all have to somehow work together as a nation.
Yeah, that's the best way of looking at it.
It's complicated.
Yeah. We won't talk about that now. So, Joe, I'm loving this. I'm absolutely loving it. I'm gonna go for. I know normally we cut it short, but I'm gonna go for an hour because this is just gold. It's absolutely gold. So, are you okay to carry on for 15 minutes? Okay, yeah. Right, so another question that we got was, what support is there for pupils who are struggling? And also, on the other end of the scale, what about if you were super, able, brainy child? How does that work?
So, well, thanks for talking to this, because this is my soapbox. Oh, yes. I have a master's degree in special education. And so when I went into teaching, my heart was for kids that have learning differences, who learn differently. And I have to say that is one of the areas that New Zealand is somewhat behind the rest of the world in their support of kids who learn differently, whether that be at the top or the bottom of the bell curve, so to speak. So kids that have severe disabilities, where they have cognitive delays or really struggle functioning, they are supported within New Zealand. They can receive special funding. There are special schools. They're largely given the support they need in the least restrictive environment. So kids that are, maybe have, Down syndrome or have some other kind of difference that might make it hard for them to participate in the classroom, they have options. But kids that have more mild or moderate learning differences, things like ADHD or on the autism spectrum or dyslexia, they don't have as much support. The support largely falls on the classroom teacher to make to differentiate the curriculum to meet their needs. But classroom teachers, we have a lot to do. And so that becomes very challenging for classroom teachers. And so oftentimes they're just sort of shuffled along. So I have to say that is one of the areas that I know the Ministry of Education is aware of that. It's part of their long-term plans. They've tried to roll out a couple of different initiatives to address it. But that is an area that people would want to consider if you've got a child that, has those needs. You might have some trouble finding the right spot for them.
Right, okay. That's interesting. What do you think is the answer? What would be the answer there?
Well, so I think one of the big problems is they don't have teacher training programs to train teachers on how to address these things. So they have some roles within the school system. For example, a lot of schools might have a SENCO, which is their special education needs coordinator or something like that. But that SENCO is usually just a passionate teacher who cares about it, but not necessarily necessarily a trained professional. So they actually don't train teachers in that area. So where I had the option of going and getting an undergraduate or master's degree to work with kids that have learning differences, that's not an option. Those programs aren't available in New Zealand. So I think that's one of the key problems. And the other key problem comes down to funding, just having enough, having somebody on your staff that works with kids. Right now, even our SYNCOs, which is the designated person, they don't work with the kids. They work with the teachers to help the kids.
Yeah.
And so you really just need a trained professional working with students. So oftentimes kids that have, learning differences are often, the answer has been schools have given them some teacher aid time, but there you have your least qualified professional working with your hardest kid, and it should be the other way around. It should be your most well-trained working with the toughest students, and that's really, you got to change that equation.
Right. Yeah. And you say the same applies for a child who is like way ahead, or? So
I told you that sometimes parents will choose because they want more rigorous academics, and that's often what will happen with our GATE students, our gifted and talented students. So oftentimes they will seek out other options that provide a little bit more rigor. Now, in the secondary schools, in our high schools, they do have more options. So they do have different programs in place for gifted and talented learners, but you typically don't get there until you're in secondary school. So the primary schools, they might have a program, they might have an after-school thing, it might... it might be run by volunteers or by parents, but there's not any specific consideration.
Okay, that's interesting. But once, like you say, once they get to high school, it changes a little bit. But it's just that primary school.
It changes a little bit. Yeah.
And that's funny what you say about the teacher aid as well. I always used to feel for the teacher aid because when I went into the classroom sometimes to do help with reading and things like that, they did that a lot in the Taranaki school that we had. They'd bring parents in to help with. Do they do that where you are as well? Is that quite common? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I think when you're having parent volunteers come in, it's a clue that you don't have the support you need to deliver to every child. So I think that's what schools try to do to get by, to do something, because they recognize kids need this help, and nobody wants a child to fail and have that cycle of failure, but so they try anything. You're going to try anything.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for answering that, Jo. Right, so it says, from a teacher's standpoint, can you reasonably do your job within the working week, or is it expected that you do more hours? I mean, you did quite answer that before with your topic work that you were saying that you did, but...
Yeah, I will say that teaching is just one of those professions. I know we get holidays off and we get, and we're supposed to be done at 3, but it's just one of those professions that your job isn't over at 3. You do have things that you have to do. You have planning and professional development and marking. Now, the marking side of things I have found to be less. There's less grading and marking than what I was doing in the States. But there is quite a bit of responsibility outside of that school hour. However, in general, New Zealand has a much better work-life balance. I find even the times that our schools, our school starts at 9. The academic day starts at 9. Kids can arrive at 8:30 at school, but and it's over at 3. So the academic day is not as long as it was in the States, and so that's helpful. So I know that when I was teaching in the States, I was getting up before 6 o'clock in the morning in order to get to school by 7 because the bell rang at 7:45 or some ridiculous time in the morning. So I think that's something nice, but Yeah, I think you can expect to work, anywhere from 45 to 50 hours a week. Right. Now, if you've been at a school for a while and you're teaching the same year level over and over, and you've gotten those, curriculum plans in place, then you might be able to get it down to 40 hours.
Yeah. But just expect about 45 to 50 when you first start, and you're just getting yourself all set up.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's great. And also someone said, is CPD, which I'm assuming is,
professional development.
Is that encouraged and supported in New Zealand schools, and are they collaborative places to work?
Yes. So, so PD, so the ministry gives each school money to do professional development every year. And typically the school then decides what area they want to invest that money in. And so it's not just your own personal, it's the whole school that sort of goes through it together. So, for example, our PD this year was on a program of well-being through physical education. So that's what our PD was about this year. And the whole school went through that together. So we all learned games and conflict resolution and those kind of things, working with kids to help increase motivation and those kind of things. That's what our PD was about this year. And the whole, we all got out there and did it together. So it's not quite as individual as it is, at least in the States, where you want to learn this, and so you take this course. The whole school does it together. And as far as, I think I talked a little bit about the collaborative, but I found New Zealand teachers to be very collaborative.
Yeah, you did. And that's when I was reading that out, I thought, you've already said this. And it's just, from what I can gather, and I don't know if this is true, I'm not going to, but from what I can gather, there's a little bit of, I want to say bitchiness at schools in the UK, maybe, in some schools. And I think some people are just worried that that's, going to be the same over here. I don't,
Well, I think that's a result of stress.
Yeah.
So, like in the States, we were so stressed out, particularly at the end of the year when it came time for our standardized exams. You're sometimes, I know I worked a job in the States where my literal job and money depended on how my students did on a standardized test. So if they didn't do well, I didn't get the bonus or whatever you got paid for the child taking the test. So you can imagine when your job, your accreditations, your paycheck is all depending on student performance, that creates stress.
Of course,
and when people are stressed, they often aren't engaging in those interpersonal relationships in a kind way because they're stressed. And so I think you'll find that New Zealand teachers are much more relaxed. There's not the need to stress out about those high stakes testing. And so for that reason, I think that you just find that they get along better.
Yeah.
They have more opportunities to work alongside one another. So
what about,
perhaps that's the reason.
Yeah, and that answers it well. Thank you, Jo. What about the parents and teachers? Do teachers have respect? Do parents have respect for the teachers? And is there that level of I don't know, when I was at school, my parents always looked up to the teacher. Oh, you do what your teacher says. Is it the same in New Zealand or not?
So I think, again, that largely depends on what community that you teach in and how responsive that school is to the local community. So I do think this is where that Board of Trustees model is so helpful, because the school is ran by people in that community. So I think that helps a good bit. I have found parents to be much more supportive and much more, like they'll just back you. Like they don't just assume that you're out to, I don't even know. I don't know why parents assume, like teachers, they don't assume that you're out to get their child. They have a base level of, okay, this person is here to help. And I appreciate that. Yeah. So I found parents to be, more open to, like they'll tell, they're much more open about what's going on. Oftentimes I would be in a meeting with a parent and I wouldn't know why the parent was upset, or they wouldn't have explained it to me, or they wouldn't have said, but they're pretty direct. This is the problems that we're having. And so approaching that as, okay, so we can work through that if I know. The more communication that we have as teachers, the better we can help your child.
Yeah, that's a good point. How often do you speak to the parents? Is it like are they allowed to just pop in after school or in the morning or?
Yeah, so much of this has changed from COVID, but I will tell you that I'll tell you pre-COVID days what it was like. Okay, so parents were allowed on school grounds. I keep wanting to say campus, but it's such an American word; they don't use it here. So parents are allowed on school grounds from 8:30 to 9. So you could come with your child, you could drop them off, you could, maybe even have a quick chat with the teacher. Obviously, we didn't encourage parents to have, formal communications during that time, but it was a hi bye and make sure you've got everything. And then parents often picked up their kids after school as well. So you had opportunities every day where you saw parents. We'd also have setting up for success meetings, our FANO meetings in the beginning of the year, where parents would come and talk with a good half hour with the teacher before I ever taught the child. So I got to hear from the parents what their goals were and what they're looking for. And it also gave you a chance to establish a relationship before anything goes wrong, you know? Because you don't want that first contact to be negative. So it was always nice to have those meetings before. And then there's often community events held at the school throughout the year. So like we'll have festivals or performances and all of those things where parents come. So pre-COVID, parents are there all the time. The school is the center of the community.
But now there's nothing. They're not allowed to drop off or anything, or?
Yeah, so now for health reasons, parents have to drop the kids off at the gate, so before they can enter school grounds, so parents aren't allowed on school grounds. We had to have virtual end-of-year assemblies where, everybody's in their individual classroom, the kids are on camera, and they're like, so-and-so gets an award for... and parents are watching and, computers at home. So, I guess we all have to be flexible and adapt to this new COVID world.
It's odd times, isn't it, Jo? It really is. It is. Right, I'm nearly done. I've got 3 more questions and then I'm going to let you go. Thank you again. Thank you so much. Have a cup of tea, Jo. Have a big swig. Right, so I'm just looking through these questions. Did we say do the schools provide all the resources, or are the staff expected to provide those? Schools provide them, don't they?
Well, schools provide the basic resources, but teachers end up resourcing different parts of the curriculum. Yeah. I would say, though, that I've always had a budget for classroom supplies. So in the States, we were always expected to purchase whatever we need for the classroom out of our own budget, but that is budgeted through the school. So I can submit receipts and get reimbursed up to a certain amount. But that's never happened to me. I was so excited. I'm like, really? Really? You're going to take this receipt and you're going to give me back my money?
Wow.
Okay.
Hang on. In America, you're in the States. I have to keep saying the States. I keep saying America and people keep telling me off for it. In the States, you had to buy your own pencils and sharpeners and everything.
Yes.
No.
Yeah. Well, kids are supposed to, but I worked in some, pretty low socioeconomic schools, and so kids didn't have stationery and they needed pencils. So who bought the pencils? I bought the pencils.
Right? Oh, that's hard to believe, Jo, isn't it? Yeah, I'd be like, don't sharpen that pencil anymore, please. That's you're only one sharpen a week.
You can still use it.
Give it a little lick. Talking about another question was low decile schools and the higher decile. I've never been able to know. I don't know this question answer, but what is the difference between a high decile school and a low decile school?
Okay, so this is one of the things I think New Zealand gets right. Not necessarily giving schools numerical deciles, but the idea of the deciles is about funding. So a low decile school is typically a school in your most disadvantaged communities, and they receive the most funding. So a decile 1 school per student gets far more money than a decile 10 school. And for that reason, they have lower class sizes, they have greater resources, and they've got more people to help, which is really a neat part about how they structured the system. So your most disadvantaged communities get the most funding. So when you see a decile rating, that just tells you the level of income in the surrounding community.
Right. Okay, right. And so the higher decile, who pays for all that then? Or is it just parents' donations?
So the Ministry of Education still pays an amount per child. It just pays a lower amount per child.
Okay, I get it.
So, so because the thought is that, so in a lot of our low decile schools, we'll have a lunch program where lunch is provided, but that doesn't happen in higher decile schools. So higher decile schools, it's packed lunches only. Now there's often programs for kids that maybe don't have that food security. There's things that we can do as a community to help them, but it's not universal.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, it does.
So there's more services in our lower decile schools.
It almost pays to go to a low decile school, doesn't it? It's like, because you're going to get there's loads more things there, and
you're going to have a lower ratios. You're going to have more staff around. You're going to get lunch.
That sounds great. That sounds fantastic.
Don't be afraid of a low decile school.
And I'm glad you said that, Jo, as well, because I don't know if it's that snobbery thing that comes in, but you tend to, like if areas that you're buying a house, it's like, oh yeah, but it's a low decile school. Maybe it's the word low decile. I don't know. You tend to think, oh, the school isn't going to be as good. But actually what you've just said, actually it's better, or not so much better, but they've got lots more facilities, and that's going to... Yeah, I'm glad you said that.
I really encourage parents to take a tour of the school. I know, for example, we rented here for a couple of years before we decided to purchase, because that was one of the things we wanted to feel comfortable of where we were living. And so I remember taking a tour. Even as a teacher, I remember taking a tour and going, oh, this is great. I'd like to go to school here. And then I felt better about sending my child. So I think it is important, if you've got some options, walk around. Like, principals are really open. Like, the tour was done by the principal, and he spent a half an hour with us, know?
Yeah.
And we weren't even students.
That's great, isn't it? That's just typical New Zealand, isn't it? They just seem to have time for people. Yeah. If you were if I moved to Auckland and I wanted my child to go to a certain school, but that wasn't do you have catchment areas?
So it depends on the school. So some schools are zoned, and they're zoned because they are at capacity and can't take students from everywhere. So if the school is zoned, then it has a catchment area, and you have to live within the catchment area. But if a school is not zoned, so Gulf Harbor School is not zoned. So if you come to us and you have the right to be in New Zealand, you have the right to be at our school.
Right, okay.
Right to education in New Zealand. You have the right to be here. So it just depends on if the school is zoned or not. And typically they only zone schools if they're at capacity.
Right, okay. Oh, right. Oh, have we answered all the questions, Jo? I don't want to let you go. I'm
think
loving
the
it.
only thing the one question that I felt was on here that I wish somebody had told me is, what does a day look like? Yeah. What does a day in primary school look like? Because it's so different. Okay. So I think, I wish I knew how this works. So I've already mentioned that school starts later than it does in the States. So 8:30 kids start arriving, and 9 o'clock the academic day starts. So a big bell rings, and all the kids come running in the classrooms because they're typically playing outside, hanging out with one another. They come in the class at 9 o'clock, and we have our first part of that academic day. And then at 10:30, so not, an hour and a half later, another bell rings, and it's morning tea time. And the kids go and they sit and they eat outside, which is something we always ate in the cafeteria. So that was just strange. The kids just take their lunch boxes out and they eat outside. We've got covered areas if it rains, but and then they play for 30 minutes. Every child across the school. So 5-year-olds to 11-year-olds, they're all outside on the playgrounds in the fields playing together. Now, obviously, this is a little different during COVID, but anyway, that is just such a strange concept to us. And then a bell rings, and the kids all come back into class. We have a second academic block, and the same thing happens at lunchtime, except instead of playing for a half an hour, they play for nearly an hour outside, all of them, unstructured play. And then we have our third academic block, and the school's over at 3 o'clock. So it's quite a different school day than we're used to, and a lot more unstructured, multi-age play.
Right.
Yeah.
That's really good to know, isn't it? Because also...
I know, because nobody knows. Yeah, like in the way it worked in the States, where we ate in the cafeteria with your class, and then you went to the playground and had recess with your class. So you could go the whole day and never see anybody but the 25 kids in your class. You know, when my son started school at 5, he had a hard time making friendships, and he played with his sister.
Yeah.
You know, because even though they're 2 years apart and in different classrooms, at that playtime. And it only lasted a couple of months before he made his own relationships and he started to do, but it was a couple of months where he had the security of knowing that he had his family around and he could see her twice a day.
I'd love to get you back and talk about, I mean, I don't know if it's something you like talking about, but that is fascinating. All these things that you're telling me about the school system in the States, it's just, I mean, why would we know about that? But you hear it and you're like, really? Yeah, it's just no wonder the people in this group are asking all these questions, because some of the questions I think, you know, why are you asking that question? But then when you hear like your point of view, you know, what it was like over there, no wonder, you know.
It's so different.
It's really different. Oh, and... don't want to let you go, Jo. Okay, before I let you go, I'm going to ask you one more thing. Ready? What is? I think I know the answer to your frustration, but what is the one frustration you have about New Zealand schools as a teacher, and what is the best bit about New Zealand schools being a teacher?
Okay, so I think I've already given my frustration that we really don't have a good way to cater kids on either side of the spectrum. You know, like... the New Zealand schools are largely meet the needs of most learners, and I think parents can feel comfortable sending their kids to pretty much any school in New Zealand. But I think that really the kids with learning differences, you know, that's a hard bit for me. Yeah, I think that's the biggest frustration. And I do think it is a huge responsibility on the teacher, you know, taking that curriculum and finding a way. So some people love that, but I find it could be overwhelming, especially teachers who weren't trained here and, you know, and haven't had that. So I think those are the frustrations. But yeah.
And what's your best bit? And don't say lunchtime.
Best bit. Okay.
Eating my Tex-Mex.
Oh, yeah. So best bit. So yeah, the best bit I think are the kids. I mean, Kiwi kids, just they're resilient and they're social. I think it you know, when you have to navigate a lot of unstructured play, you have to learn to get along with one another with low, you know, interactions with adults. They have to work it out themselves. And so I think that really makes them resilient problem solvers. And so I really enjoy that aspect. And I think too, like, they're not afraid to get dirty, you know, like school is, you know, nobody's afraid to get dirty. Nobody cares what you're wearing, you know, yeah, Kiwi kids are just so fun. So I really enjoyed teaching and, you know, teaching the kids.
Oh, I've absolutely loved talking to you, Jo. And all the things that you're saying are explaining to me now why. Because I found, like exactly like you say, you meet Kiwi children and they're like, you think, you know, where did you get these skills from? Like they're very confident and they don't mind talking, and, you know, they're just, like you say, they just get on with it. And they've learned it. Well, obviously they've learned it from their family and their parents, but they've learned it from school, like you just said, because they're left to play for such a long period of time, and they're just, you know, all playing together in different age groups. That's a healthy way to be, isn't it? So, yeah, it's really shone a light on it.
And there's not a lot of... I mean, there's playgrounds and there's climbing things and, you know, you can check out some balls to play with the courts, but it's largely like you have to navigate that play all on your own. There's not somebody saying, hey, we're going to play a game of pickup football, you know, out on the field. The kids have to say, okay, you're going to be the goalie and I'm going to be the kicker, and we've got to work this stuff out together. You know, I know my kids during those long periods of time to do a lot of creative and imaginative plays, like, oh, today we're all being cats and you're the mommy cat and I'm the baby cat, and they do that for hours every day outside.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. I absolutely love it. I have to warn you, Joe, I know that once this goes out, I'm going to have people saying, will you get back and talk about this? So I hope you'll be able to come back and chat with me and do like a part 2. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. And if I was a little child and I wanted to teach her, I would want you to teach me because you just seem so lovely. So you've really shone such a great light on this, you know, this uncertainty that people have about being a teacher in New Zealand and also about being a kid in New Zealand and going to school in New Zealand. Yeah. So I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you, Joe. Absolutely. Okay, I'll see you soon. Bye.
Okay,
Bye.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks, Joe. Oh, I loved that.
No worries.
Oh, loved it.
Hello.
Oh, didn't you just love that? Didn't you just love Joanne? Honestly, it was one of the best interviews I've ever done, simply because that lady knows her stuff and she just has a way of delivering it to you so clearly. Thank you so much, Joanne. Thank you, Ryan, for introducing me to your lovely wife. She's absolutely gorgeous. Now, as promised, if you're still here and you want to know about how you can be part of our private New Zealand community group, then listen and I'll tell you all about it. So Brian and I offer a free 5-day video guide. That's absolutely free. You must have heard me talk about it lots. You probably heard a little advert in the show that you've just listened to. That's absolutely free. It's a 5-day video guide. And at the end of that guide, you are then offered a chance to purchase the NZ Ahead Ultimate Package. Within that package, there's over 7 hours and growing videos that Brian and I have made. There's absolutely no B footage. It's all stuff that has happened in our life and we filmed it. You know, we go to schools and doctors and everywhere. It's a brilliant package. And we also give monthly private podcasts that we don't put out to the public. There's a bunch of good stuff in that New Zealand Calling package, but probably the most valuable thing in there is the community. When you join up, you become a member of the private community. And at the moment, we've got 115 people in there. And they're all moving to New Zealand. These people adore New Zealand, and these people are all planning on moving to New Zealand. We've got teachers in there. We've got IT, doctors, nurses, all different professions, people with kids, people with wanting to join their grandchildren, all different ages. The common theme in that group is we love New Zealand and we want to make a new life there. If that sounds like something that you would be interested in joining, then we would love to have you. Brian and I facilitate that group. We're there if you want to ask us questions. But to be honest, the people that are already living in New Zealand and they've just moved to New Zealand, they're the ones that can give you that up-to-date information, that they've just gone through that big move themselves and they're right there to help you. So, like I say, if that is something that you're interested in, we would love to have you. Head over to www.nzahead.com/free. That's www.nzahead.com/free. Sign up for the free 5-day video guide, and at the end of that, you'll be given very clear directions of how to go on to the next stage of purchasing the package. I really hope to see you on the other side. I can't wait to get to know you better. And like I say, I hope you enjoyed this wonderful episode. Thank you again so much, Joanne. You've been an absolute star. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast this week. We have loved having you here with us.
If you love this week's show, please share this with your friends. Send it to anybody you know that wants to think about moving to New Zealand, and get on over here yourself.
And tell them how brilliant it is as well. And also, if you haven't signed up for our free 5-day video guide showing you what life is like, really like, in New Zealand, then go over to the website and sign up. You are missing out. This is brilliant. Go over to www.nzahead.com/free and we will send you 5 days worth of videos about what life is like in New Zealand. You are going to love it. So one more time, that website that you need to sign up for the free 5-day guide is www.nzahead.com/free. So we're going to see you next week. Until then, have a great week and we'll speak to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Say bye again. Bye.
Bye.